questions and reflections. Let's do this. We are going to start first and foremost on Kierkegaard today. So, what are the two philosophical attitudes or outlooks on the world Sophie experiences by drinking the potions Alice gives her, and how do they differ? Hope you remember these. Specifically, we can find these on page 375. Midway down, it says, "It felt as if the lake and this is after Sophie has started drinking the first one. It felt as if the lake and the woods and the cabin all merged into one. Soon it seemed that everything she saw was one person. That person was Sophie herself. She glanced up at Alberto, but he too seemed to be part of Sophie's soul. Curiouser and curiouser, she said." By the way, if you've never read Alice in Wonderland, that's Alice's line. Curiouser and curiouser. "Everything looks like it did before, but now it's all one thing. I feel as if everything is one thought." Alberto nodded, but it seemed to Sophie that it was she nodding to herself. "It is pantheism, or idealism," he said. "It is the romantics' world spirit. They experienced everything as one big ego. It is also Hegel, who was critical of the individual, and who saw everything as the expression of the one and only world reason." Right? So that's the first one, pantheism / idealism, romantic world spirit, however you wanted to answer that particular one. Those are not all synonymous, but for this purpose, they all contribute to the same worldview. Now, a little bit farther down the same page, she drinks the second one. "Instantly, the effects of the red bottle disappeared and everything slid back to its normal place. Alberto was Alberto, the trees were back in the woods, and the water looked like a lake again. But it only lasted a second because things went on sliding away from each other. The woods were no longer woods, and every little tree now seemed like a world in itself. The tiniest twig was like a fairy tale world about which 1,000 stories could be told." And we'll skip some of this other wonderful descriptions. I love it, actually, but we're going to skip down a little bit just to save us on time. "The most curious of all was the sight that met her eyes when she stood up again and looked at Alberto, still standing on the front step of the cabin. In Alberto, she now saw a wondrous person. He was like a being from another planet or an enchanted figure out of its fairy tale. At the same time, she experienced herself in a completely new way as a unique individual." We should be thinking of Kierkegaard here again. "She was more than just a human being, a 15-year-old girl. She was Sophie Amundsen, and only she was that." So what is this? Go to 377, where it continues. Alberto speaks here. "It is as I suspected. The blue bottle is individualism. It is, for example, so in Kierkegaard's reaction to the idealism of the romantics." There you have it. So those are the two. I noticed, by the way, he did include Leibniz here. I had forgotten this. As many times I've read it, I find new stuff all the time. He did mention Leibniz here, who also revolted against those like Spinoza and their idealism as well. Love you, Leibniz. Obviously, how do they differ? Individualism versus the idealism / pantheism view of the romantics. We were describing in the in-depth look as well as this sort of unified, this monist almost type of way of looking at the world. Everything is one. All things are just different aspects of the same thing, etc., versus this alternative individualism, which views first and foremost, at least in history, the individual human being, each as particularly unique and interesting and so forth, an individual. But we can take it further, and Gaarder does, thankfully, and says, looks at the ants, looks at the trees, admires each individual cloud. Imagine every particle of cloud, the uniqueness. If we take anyone like Leibniz seriously, then no two things are identical, which means everything indeed, metaphysically speaking, would be unique and individual in this way. It's certainly a way that I aspire toward myself more fully. Next up, what three potential stages of life are there according to Kierkegaard, and what distinguishes them from each other? Also, what philosophical movement did this give way to? So those three stages we went through, in-depth view. We said already it was the aesthetic, the ethic, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. But let's find our specific page references. We're going to look on page 382. Towards the bottom of the page now. Kierkegaard believed that there were 3 different forms of life. He himself used the term stages. He calls them the aesthetic stage, the ethical stage, and the religious stage. He used the term stage to emphasize that one can live at one of the 2 lower stages and then suddenly leap to a higher stage. Many people live at the same stage all their life, though. Skipping over to 383. He who lives at the aesthetic stage lives for the moment and grasps every opportunity of enjoyment. Good is whatever is beautiful, satisfying, or pleasant. This person lives wholly in the world of the senses and is a slave to his own desires and moods. Everything is boring and bad. Everything that is boring is bad. That's a very different philosophy there. Everything that is boring is bad. Skip down a little bit farther. A person who lives at the aesthetic stage can easily experience angst, or a sense of dread and a feeling of emptiness. If this happens, there is also hope. According to Kierkegaard, angst is almost positive. It is an expression of the fact that the individual is in an existential situation and can now elect to make the great leap to a higher stage, and continue onward about that. And then to get to the last stage here, let's go to 384. Sophie comments, "The best you can do is choose a different form of life. And so perhaps you will begin to live the ethical stage. This is characterized by seriousness and consistency of moral choices. This approach is not unlike Kant's ethics of duty. You try to live by the law of morals. Kierkegaard, like Kant, drew attention first and foremost to human temperament. The important thing is not what you may think is precisely right or wrong. What matters is that you choose to have an opinion at all on what is right or wrong. The aesthete's only concern is whether something is fun or boring. The aesthete, again, is the person who's still stuck in the aesthetic stage. Isn't there a risk of becoming too serious living like that? Decidedly. Kierkegaard never claimed that the ethical stage was satisfactory." We can skip down a little bit further. But others make a new leap to the religious stage. They take the jump into the abyss of faith's 70,000 fathoms. They choose faith in preference to aesthetic pleasure and reason's call of duty. And although it can be terrible to jump into the open arms of the living God, as Kierkegaard puts it, it is the only path to redemption. Christianity, you mean, says Sophie. Yes, because to Kierkegaard, the religious stage was Christianity. But he also became significant to non-Christian thinkers. Existentialism, inspired by the Danish philosopher, flourished widely in the 20th century, and we'll see more about that in later chapters. Now, again, we've gone into length in the in-depth chapter, or in-depth look video on this too, so I hope you have more than enough input on these 3 stages and how they differ. And of course, the philosophical movement, existentialism, which will characteristically not be religious at some point in the near future of our story. What did Marx take away from Hegel, and what does Gaarder mean in saying that Marx believed Hegel to be standing on his head? Again, mentioned it in the in-depth video. So this is on page 392. Towards the top. Each in his own way, both Kierkegaard and Marx, took Hegel's philosophy as their point of departure. Both were influenced by Hegel's mode of thought, but both rejected his world spirit, or his idealism. That gives you the point of similarity, so let's jump over to point 393 for difference. Sophie says, that was quite different from Hegel's world spirit, talking about materialism and so forth. Hegel had pointed out that historical development is driven by the tension between opposites, which is then resolved by a sudden change. Marx developed this idea further, but according to Marx, Hegel was standing on his head. Hegel called the force that drives history forward world spirit or world reason. This, Marx claimed, is upside down. He wished to show that material changes are the ones that affect history. Spiritual relations do not create material change. It is the other way around. And we had a very different way of understanding what materialism means in this context. Again, go back to the in-depth look video if you need more details on that. And then next, what forces did Marx believe were the actual cause for changes in society? And how do these forces play out, according to him, in building the basis and superstructure of society? We did not talk about these aspects, particularly in the in-depth chapter. in-depth video. But again, I think Gaarder lays it out pretty well on his own. So here we've got, again, 393. Marx particularly emphasized that it was the economic forces in society that created change and thus drove history forward. And you could have also said material changes as well. But jumping a little farther down, that was because of the way the economic life of the community was organized. Production was mainly based on slave labor, so the citizens had no need to increase production with practical innovations. This is an example of how material relations help to affect philosophical reflection in society. Remember our Aristotle's comment on the Olympics in Greek culture example in the in-depth video. Marx called these material, economic, and social relations the basis of society. The way a society thinks, what kind of political institutions there are, which laws it has, and not least, what there is of religion, morals, art, philosophy, and science. Marx called society's superstructure. So basis is underneath, superstructure is up top. But that's not all. Importantly, look on page 394, a little farther down. It is the interactive effect of society's basis on its superstructure. If Marx had rejected this interaction, he would have been a mechanical materialist. Mechanical materialist, the kind of materialism we've been used to thinking about up to this point. But because Marx realized that there was an interactive or dialectic relation between bases and superstructure, we say that he is a dialectical materialist. So, in other words, again, these two things have to come in contact with each other. They interact and influence one another, superstructure and basis, and then it gives way to a new, you could say, superstructure over time, and higher levels of society develop from original agricultural societies to feudalism to capitalism, perhaps, and then to communism in the end. And so that's the way we need to think about it. As a systems thinker myself, I tend to think of the dialectic as almost like a form of feedback loop, except that a feedback loop doesn't always give rise to new emergent phenomenon. It can, but doesn't always. Dialectics questionably always do in some form. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But either way, the dialectical materialism of Hegel is what's important here in discussing basis versus superstructure stuff. You've got what's going down at the base of society, the labor, the material goods, and so forth, and then you have the superstructure, the religion, the art, philosophy, etc., happening on a layer on top of that, and they're interacting with each other. They dialectically oppose one another, but then they give way to new structures as tensions arise, such as between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie in his own work. Well, speaking of these two, between what two classes of society did Marx believe there was constant conflict and why? I just said it. Proletariat versus bourgeoisie. But let's find again the reference so that we have a little more context. This we'll find on the very next page, 396. Midway down, Marx believed that in all phases of history there has been a conflict between two dominant classes of society. To be clear, these are not always the same two classes. But they do occupy the same two roles. In antiquity's slave society, the conflict was between free citizen and slave. In the feudal society of the Middle Ages, it was between feudal lord and serf, always the laborer versus the upper class. Later on, between aristocrat and citizen. But in Marx's own time, in what he called a bourgeois or capitalist society, the conflict was first and foremost between the capitalists and the workers or the proletariat. So the conflict stood between those who own the means of production and those who do not. And since the upper classes do not voluntarily relinquish their power, change can only come about through revolution. This is also, again, the whole concept of revolution, that this is what gave way to the horrible, catastrophic versions of communism we've seen in the world before. And it's debatable whether or not the more peaceable versions of socialism that exist in some places in the world without revolution as its main impetus aren't doing a much better job of implementing some theory, some derivative theory of Marx than anything that we've seen in communism. I would assume so, and I would hypothesize as such. But what is so this again is the tension between the always a lower strata and a higher strata, and that tension is there in conflict because that is how, as it were, history moves forward. It's how we get dialectically again from this tension of between two opposites to a higher layer or structure or level of society, from again feudal to capitalist to communist and so forth. But it's almost like prescribing revolution is like seeing a nail in everything and going at it with a hammer. You're liable to cause destruction and not solve most of the problems that don't involve nails and hammers. The next question is, what two mainstreams did socialism historically split into after Marx, and how are they different? And I referred to them by accident just a moment ago as well. This we're going to see on page 401, also about midway down. After Marx, the socialist movement split into two mainstreams, social democracy and Leninism. We mentioned briefly about social democracy earlier in the in-depth video. Social democracy, which has stood for a gradual and peaceful path in direction of socialism, was Western Europe's way. By the way, the United States also has its own version, which I think may fundamentally be in some ways more beneficial, but regardless, it has its own version of social democracy that's worth investigating. We might call this the slow revolution. Leninism, which retained a Marxist belief that revolution was the only way to combat the old class society, had great influence in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa. Each in their own way, both movements have fought against hardship and oppression. And I'm sorry, but this is, again, and you've seen in the in-depth video why, but this is where I have to push back hard on Gaarder, if only for committing the fallacy of omission, to not characterize the right-wing version of this theory work as so clearly, so blatantly violent, and so terribly condemning of the citizens who partake in such a culture or society that embraces this type of philosophy of revolution. It's the mistake of omission. It's simply missing out on something that's very critical to understand. In this little play out between Scrooge and the match girl that happens in this book, it's not clear how damaging in analogy the match girl's lighting of the fire that is likely to set to the entire woods, how many people would actually embrace that today is phenomenally, overwhelmingly large, which is terrible to think about. The burning of the entire woods would equate to the destruction of how many, not just people's homes, but animals' homes and nature itself. There's so much that stands to be destroyed by this attitude. And I think Gaarder actually, in at least this one way, fails to depict in a very important way how this particular philosophy and how philosophy really can bring people to a point of sheer absolute violence and hatred. And the tragedy of that is just completely underrated, undervalued by this story so far. That's all I have for the questions at this moment. But I want to point out a couple of other quick things to you. Page 387. What is with this quote? What matters are creative endless toil. When at a snatch oblivion ends the coil. This is in the letter that Albert Nag sends. And Sophie finds it in the envelope from him, from the UN battalion. Okay, what is this quote? First of all, did you look up to see who it could be? Just out of curiosity. Secondly, after you've done that, have you thought about what it means? What matters are creative endless toil. When at a snatch oblivion ends the coil. It's dense language, but it's worth parsing out, and there are always reasons for Gaarder to put these in his book. On page 388, I have to point out just the hilarity, if that, the funniness of perhaps of the prize that they're deciding on for Sophie's birthday party. The prize they decided should preferably be a book about philosophy for young people. If there was such a thing, Sophie was not sure was not at all sure. Why isn't she sure? She's in one. She is the philosophy book. Fun. That's it for this week, everybody. For next week, excitingly, we're going to talk about the last these two chapters coming up, Darwin and Freud. These are the last two chapters in this entire book that pertain to specific individual thinkers instead of talking about thinkers in the context of broader movements. So we're getting very close to the end, and I'll be very excited to talk about more modern times as we get to them. So I'll see you next time.